Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 36, Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. Now, the nice thing about this chapter is there's no new grammatical information. If you've completed Chapter 35 in the grammar, you've completed all of the necessary chapters for learning basic biblical Hebrew. In this chapter, we're just going to be looking at the Hebrew Bible and trying to figure out how to use it and what it's all about. Let's begin by talking about the orientation of the Hebrew Bible, the orientation. You see on my desk here, I have a copy of the Hebrew Bible. Now, I lay it on my desk, and the first thing you'll notice is this is backwards for Hebrew, but it's the right way for English. Now, in my English Bible orientation, I'm going to open my book on the left this way. But remember, Hebrew is not written from left to right like English. It's written from right to left. So what you have to do in order to open up your Hebrew Bible correctly is flip it over. Once you flip open your Hebrew Bible, you're now ready to open the Hebrew Bible to the correct page, the beginning. If we open on the left, we're going to open at the end. And you don't want to begin at the end. You want to begin at the beginning. So the first thing you do with your Hebrew Bible is flip it over. It will look odd, but in Hebrew, you begin at the right and you move to the left. That's the first thing. Now let's just talk about the name of this book. The name of this book. Look at your screen. The name of this volume is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, a Latin expression meaning Hebrew Bible, published in Stuttgart, Germany. So all this is telling you is what the volume is and where it's published, in a town, Stuttgart, in Germany. Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Now scholars and students will refer to this volume as the BHS. So if you hear that nomenclature, now you know exactly what they're talking about. It's not their Bible, not their Hebrew Bible, it's BHS for some reason. Now that BHS appears on the English side, the left side of the Bible. But if you turn the Bible over, this is the side that you're going to want to open it from, you'll see three Hebrew words: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Now, those are the Hebrew words for law, prophets, and writings. Frequently, you'll see the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible referred to as the Tanakh. That particular name derives from these three words: Torah, T, Nevi'im, N, Ketuvim, K, and then you add A vowels in there to say the word Tanakh. Those are the three main divisions of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is divided into three: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Now, in our English Bibles in the Old Testament, we have a slightly different arrangement, right? We have four divisions in our Old Testament. We begin with the Pentateuch, or the law, then we go to the historical books, then we go to the poetical books, and then we go to the prophetical books. An arrangement more according to genre and chronology. Now, the Hebrew Bible has a slightly different arrangement, and so we need to take a look at that arrangement. So do this. Place your Hebrew Bible in the correct orientation, so you're opening it from the left, and open to the table of contents. So let's look at our screens together now, and you'll see the table of contents that would appear at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. It's labeled Index Librorum Biblicorum, the index or table of contents for biblical books in the Hebrew Bible. You'll see two columns, a column on the left and a column on the right. And each column has two sets of names. There's a Latin name and then a Hebrew name for each book. Now, as you scan through the list, one of the first things you're going to recognize as you're looking at the list, some of the books will appear to be out of order to you based upon the English Bible arrangement of your Old Testament that you memorized in Sunday school. So let's take a look at the order of the Hebrew Bible, just so you know where to look for books in your Hebrew Bible. Now, we begin with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and you can see that there are Latin names for those and then Hebrew names for those. The Hebrew names and the Latin names don't always correspond. For example, Genesis is the term that we use normally to describe the book, the first book of the Hebrew Bible, but the Hebrew name is Bereshith, in the beginning. It's simply the first word in the book of Genesis. That's a very popular way that Hebrew books are named in the Hebrew Bible, according to the first word in that book. Look at Exodus. The name for the book of Exodus is Shemoth, names. Well, that's simply the first word in the book of Exodus. Look at Leviticus, Vayikra, and he called. Now that's kind of an unusual title in how we would title books today, and he called. But remember, in Hebrew, they would frequently just name the book after the first word in that book. And that's what happened for Numbers and Deuteronomy as well. So those are the Pentateuch books, the books of Moses, the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or Bereshith, Shemoth, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim. Those are the names in Hebrew. Now, you don't have to know the names in Hebrew, but it just is nice to understand what's going on so that you can see the correspondence at some level. Next in the Hebrew Bible, we move to the prophets. Now, the prophets are divided into 2. There are the former prophets and the latter prophets. And according to the Hebrew numbering, there are 4 each. The former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Book of the 12. That is 12 minor prophets. Now, they don't list the Book of the 12 here as one book. They give you actually each of the individual minor prophets. So after the Pentateuch, on the column on the left, you see Joshua, or in Hebrew, Yehoshua, meaning Joshua; Judges, Shophatim, meaning judges in Hebrew; Shemuel and Melachim, Samuel and Kings, or in Latin, Reges, Kings. Now, a couple of things to observe here. Number one, when it comes to Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the former prophets, you'll notice that Samuel and Kings are listed as one book. In the Hebrew Bible, Samuel and Kings are considered one book each. Now, when those books were translated into Greek, the translation of the Greek was longer. That is, it took more Greek words to translate the fewer Hebrew words. Therefore, it took more scrolls, and they divided the book so it would fit on the scrolls. So once you get the Greek translation of these books, Samuel and Kings, they were divided into 1 Samuel and 1 Kings. But originally, they were conceived of as one book, Samuel and Kings, and so you'll just see that one book listing in the table of contents, Samuel and Kings. You'll also notice that the book of Ruth does not follow the book of Judges. The book of Ruth occurs way more towards the end. Be patient, I'll tell you why in just a minute. Now, after Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, you get the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, each named after the author, and then Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, each again named after the author. Now, here's the thing. In the normal Hebrew way of accounting for these books, both the former prophets and the latter prophets, there are 4 in each category. Again, the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. The latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Book of the 12. Now, I like the whole Book of the 12 nomenclature. It makes memorizing the order of the books easier. Remember back in those days in Sunday school when you had to memorize the prophets, it was always the minor prophets that gave you the trouble. Now, for the Hebrew listing, it's just one group, the Book of the 12. So that's nice. So that's the Pentateuch, or the law, the books of Moses, the former prophets and the latter prophets, and then the last section in the Hebrew Bible is known as the writings. Let's look at our screens again. The writings begin with the book of Psalms, the book of Psalms. And you can see the Latin name there, which looks like the book of Psalms, Psalmi. But then you see the Hebrew name, Tehillim, which just means prayers or praises. That's what the word means. Now, you may recall in Luke 24, when Jesus is speaking to his disciples on the road to Emmaus, he referred to his Hebrew Bible as the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. The law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So Jesus was working with this threefold division of the Hebrew Bible that we see here, and he simply listed the third division, Psalms, by the book that appears at the head of that division, Psalms. So the Psalms, or the writings. Psalms is followed by Job. And you can see both the Latin name and the Hebrew name correspond to what we think of in English as Job, but the J sound looks like an I in both Latin and Hebrew. Job is followed by Proverbs, and then Proverbs is followed by Ruth. Now that's nice. So there's Ruth. Ruth was displaced, right? Ruth in our English Bibles is behind Judges. In our Hebrew Bibles, Ruth is behind Proverbs. Now why? Now this is free advice. It's not part of the lecture at all, but let me just share with you why. In Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, a king or a father is teaching his sons or disciples wisdom. And at the highest point of Hebrew wisdom is Proverbs 31, get a good wife. And the woman in Proverbs 31 is called the Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, the woman of nobility, the woman of strength, the wife of noble character. The only woman ever called that in Hebrew is Ruth. So you can see in Proverbs 31, the woman of noble character is described. And then in the next book, Ruth, you have the woman of noble character illustrated. So that's in some sense why the book of Ruth follows Proverbs. You have the exposition in Proverbs and the illustration in Ruth. And that's a little bit how the Hebrew Bible works. It's not arranging its books by genre and chronology, but more by theme and theology. Let's look again at the screen. After Ruth comes Canticum, or Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, or Canticles as you might know it, the Song of Songs, followed by Ecclesiastes, or in Hebrew, Koheleth. Now the name Koheleth is derived from the book Ecclesiastes, and it's something like the preacher or the one who assembles or calls out. It's the name of the person who is being expressed as the narrator in the book. So in Latin, Ecclesiastes, or in English, Ecclesiastes, but in Hebrew, Koheleth. The next book is very hard to figure out what it is, Threnai, or Echa. Now Threnai in Latin means tears or weeping. Now in Hebrew, the word Echa means how. This is the book Lamentations, and in Hebrew, Echa means how, and that's simply the first word in the book of Lamentations, and so that's what they call it in this particular case. Lamentations, or Echa, Threnai, is followed by Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Now, Chronicles is named Devarei Hayamim, the words of the days. And like Samuel and Kings, Chronicles is simply one book. When they translated Chronicles, it was too large to fit on a single scroll in the Greek representation, and so they divided it. But in Hebrew, it's conceived of as one book. So here's the listing. Look again at your screen, and you'll see these are the books of the Hebrew Bible as they appear in your Hebrew Bible. Law and prophets and writings. I remember when I first wanted to read the Hebrew Bible after my Hebrew classes, I wanted to translate a short book. We had worked on Jonah, and I wanted to move to Ruth, another short book. And so I went in my English Bible arrangement, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and all of a sudden I was fraught with despair because I couldn't find Ruth. I thought something had happened to my Hebrew Bible. I'd gotten a bad printing. So you'll want to be aware of the order of the books here so that you'll know where to find the book that you're looking for. And once you've learned your Hebrew grammar, you want to pick books and read them every day and never stop reading. Pick smaller books, then larger books, then larger books, until you can read through the Hebrew Bible as often as possible. Now I just want you to turn the page, and you'll be on the first page of your Hebrew Bible, the actual biblical text, Genesis 1. Genesis 1. As you look at Genesis 1 on the page, you're going to see an explosion of marks. An explosion of marks. Things written in the margin, things written above the text, things written below the text. What's going on here? What's going on? Look at your screen with me. When you're looking at BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or your Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, you're really looking at a number of different layers, And so let me peel back all of the layers of the Hebrew Bible at this point and just go layer by layer and show you what you're encountering so that you're not overwhelmed by seeing that explosion on the first page. On your screen, you will now see the first few verses of Genesis chapter 1. And what you will observe is that there are only consonants present. Only consonants. When the Hebrew Bible was originally written, it was written with a consonantal text alone. None of the vowels or the accent marks that you're about to see appeared in the original manuscripts. Moses did not write with Hebrew vowels. David did not write with Hebrew vowels. Ezra did not write with Hebrew vowels. Solomon did not write with Hebrew vowels. Isaiah did not write with Hebrew vowels. They simply worked with a consonantal text, something that would have looked much like what you see on your screen now, the consonants. Now, in fact, this is the inspired portion of the text. The consonantal text is the inspired portion of the text. Everything else is perspired. So what you're seeing right now on your screen is the inspired text. But now let's move from inspiration to perspiration. The next image you'll see on your screen are those same consonants, but now they appear with the vowels. Now you're fully aware of what these vowels look like, what these vowels sound like, and how they work in the Hebrew system. You've probably been studying them now for about a year if you're in this chapter, the Hebrew vowels. These vowels were added by a group of scholars known as the Masoretes, those who preserve the tradition of the vocalization or pronunciation of the Hebrew text. They began to do this in the second half of the first millennium AD. Almost 2,000 years after Moses would have written the Pentateuch, the Masoretes began to preserve the vocalization of the text by adding these vowels. Look at your screen again, and you'll see that now we have two layers, both the consonants and the vowels. Now, the vowels are very helpful and certain and sure guides, but they are not inspired. They are the work of the Masoretes to preserve the text, and they are the historical, traditional, authoritative interpretation of how to pronounce those consonants. So we rely on them, but just remember, there's a difference between the inspired consonantal text and the perspired work of the Masoretes to preserve the pronunciation. It's authoritative and rely on it, but I want you to be aware of that difference. The third layer that we'll encounter in the Hebrew text is the accent system or the cantillation system of the Hebrew Bible. Look at your screens with me now. You're now looking at three layers when you look at the Genesis 1 text. You've got the consonants, the vowels, and the accent marks. Now, the accent marks are very small, and like the vowels, they're placed above and below the consonants. Those accent marks have both grammatical information encoded in them and musical information encoded in them. They help you to chant or to sing the text. They help you to know when to pause or when to continue in your reading. That's what the cantillation marks do. Now, there are a number of different cantillation marks, and they occur in two different systems. There's the narrative system, and then there's the poetic system, the book of the three, the Psalms, the Proverbs, and Job. There's a slightly different system in those three books called the Book of the Truth. Now, at this point in your studies, it's not important that you memorize all of the accents and what the accents do. That's something for Hebrew 3. Later in this lecture, I'll give you an idea of what the major accents do and what you need to be aware of. For now, all I want you to observe on this page is the three layers that exist on the screen. Look again. There's the consonants, the inspired part of the text. Then there are the vowels. Then there are the accent marks. The vowels and the accent marks are the work of the Masoretes, who preserve the authoritative, traditional pronunciation and vocalization of the text, the perspired portion of the information on your page. Very good. So that's three layers. You've got the consonants, the vowels, and the accents. Well, what's next? Look at your screen again with me. Now we're actually looking at the first page of BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or the Tanakh, or your Hebrew Bible. This is simply the image that you should be looking at as you're looking at your Hebrew Bible. Now we can see the three layers at work that we've just discussed, the consonants, the vowels, and the accents. But we also see a number of other features on the page that we need to talk about. There's the title of the book, the Masorah, the apparatus, and paragraph markers. So as you look at this page, you're seeing as many as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different layers of information. 7 different layers of information. So let's peel some of those layers back and identify what we're looking at. Here you'll see on your screen, highlighted in yellow, the book title. The book title. On the first page of each new book, at the top of the page, you will see the book title, just like it appeared in the table of contents, both the Latin name Genesis and then the Hebrew name Bereshith. You can then see that the Hebrew name Bereshith is derived from the first word in the book of Genesis, Bereshith. That's the book title. Fairly simple. The next thing we want to observe on the Hebrew page is what we call the Masorah. Look at your screens with me now. On your screens, you will see information highlighted in yellow in the left column and immediately under the Hebrew text. This is called the Masorah. These are the footnotes of the Masoretes as they worked on the Hebrew text, providing the accents and the vowels for vocalization. They wanted to make comments about word order and frequency and unusual forms and alternative readings, and they did this in a system that we would consider, much like today, footnoting a text. But they did it by putting it in the margins, either in the side or above or below. Now, there are two different Masorahs that you'll see on your screen. There's the Masorah Parva and the Masorah Magna. The Masorah Parva, or small Masorah, is what you see in the left column. The left column. Those are small notes, usually about how many times a particular construction occurs in the Hebrew Bible, which is pretty amazing because they didn't have computers. They knew this because they read the text and they counted the forms. It's a remarkable system. And it also helped them to preserve the integrity of the text as they would copy it, because these notes would help them to understand what they're encountering and how often they will encounter it. Now look at your screen with me again. The Masorah Parva is in the left column, and then there's also the Masorah Magna, which is the larger Masorah, the large Masorah. Now, the large Masorah in the manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible would occur above the text and below the text on the page. Now, in this particular edition of BHS, that aspect of the text is not fully preserved. Rather, they have abbreviated it. We call it the MM, or the Masorah Magna Register, and we've put it in a footnote system below the text. You can see all the different MMs if you're looking closely at your page. And that information is recorded in separate volumes, Now, by and large, you will never have to work with the Masorah Magna at the bottom of that page you see highlighted in yellow, all right? In a new edition of the Hebrew Bible that's just beginning to come out, BHQ, Biblia Hebraica Quinta, they're actually listing the Masorah now in its fullness. Perhaps in years to come, you may have an opportunity to work with the Masorah Magna in these volumes, but not now. For now, this information is encoded at the bottom in the MM register, and you have to have access to the other volumes, which are hard to get, in order to get this information. Now, the Masorah Magna is usually an elaboration on information you see in the Masorah Parva. They're most often related. But for now, it's just enough that you begin to read the Hebrew Bible. You don't have to decode this information because it's tough. Let me tell you, the Masorah Parva, the small Masorah, as you look on your screen on the left, is actually Aramaic abbreviations. So not only do you have to know Aramaic, but you have to know what the Aramaic abbreviations stand for. Now, there are books that help you with that, but that's beyond the scope of what you're doing right now. But it is interesting to know what's on the page and know what to observe and what you can disregard for now. Now, I love this kind of stuff, and I love studying it, and maybe you will too later. But for now, it's nothing that you need to concern yourself with. Let's look together at one final item that appears on the page. Look at your screens with me. Here we have what is called the textual apparatus, and it appears at the very bottom of your page, and on this screen it's highlighted in yellow. This is not a Masoretic system. This is a system developed by modern scholars when they study the text. Now, the Hebrew Bible is an interesting thing. The Hebrew Bible that we have today in our printed editions is what we know as a diplomatic edition of the Hebrew Bible. That is, it's a faithful copy of one complete manuscript, the Leningrad Codex that dates to about 1009, 1006 AD. That single manuscript is reproduced here. Now, there are a lot of other Hebrew manuscripts out there, some just of the Pentateuch, some just of the prophets, some in good condition, some in bad condition. We have the Qumran manuscripts, and we try to collate all of that information into our understanding of the text. With any single text, there may be very minor or slight changes or variations or errors in it. In textual criticism, or the use of the textual apparatus, what we do is we identify all of that information and put it at the bottom of the page, so when students or teachers are working on translating and interpreting the biblical text, they have all of that information at their disposal. Now, again, you'll see a lot of Latin abbreviations, some Greek, some Hebrew, some longer words, some brackets, all kinds of different siglia. It's a pretty complicated system, but you can read about that in the introduction, and there are also books on that. For example, the Simplified Guide to BHS is a book that talks about all that and how this works. There are books on textual criticism. You don't need to worry yourself about this information now. The information here is generally for scholars who are working to preserve and interpret the biblical text. At this point, once again, you don't need to worry about that. The Masorah Parva, the Masorah Magna, the textual apparatus, that is good and helpful information, and many people, like myself, enjoy studying that and working with it. For now, however, you can disregard it because what you want to work with is the Hebrew text. You should spend a lot of time working with the Hebrew text before you even begin to worry about this material. But it's helpful to know what this is so that you're not caught off guard as you work through the Hebrew Bible and see all of the different features on each page. Now, as you thumb through the Hebrew Bible, you'll notice that the Masorah Parva and the Masorah Magna and the textual apparatus appears on each page in the Hebrew Bible. So it's something you're going to see everywhere, and you just want to know what it is and why it's there. Now, there's one more feature that I want to identify for you on the page of the Hebrew Bible that you're going to see in the first page of Genesis here. Look at your screens with me. You'll see on your screens now 3 Hebrew letters. In fact, they're all the same Hebrew letter, the Hebrew letter Pei, highlighted in yellow. Those are simply paragraph markers that were used to preserve reading traditions. And what it would be like is, in the Hebrew synagogue, they would simply read different portions of Scripture each week. Those paragraph markers marked the paragraphs that they would read throughout the system. So you're going to see two different marks. You're going to see a Pe floating out in white space and a Samik floating out in white space. They stand for Patuma and Satuma, open paragraphs and closed paragraphs. And for now, you don't need to worry about really what those mean or how they use them. They simply mark paragraphs in Hebrew. Now, in the original Hebrew manuscripts, there were no such paragraph breaks or paragraph markers. Once again, this is something we've included to make the text easier to read and digest. All right? So this is not the inspired category of material. This is the perspired category of material. Now, most of the times these are helpful breaks, and you can see the narrative breaks there. But sometimes they're not always that helpful, and you want to make sure that you're checking to make sure the narrative or the story is over before you actually stop at a paragraph break. But you'll learn about that as you engage the Hebrew Bible more and more. Let's look at yet another feature that appears in your Hebrew Bible that is not necessarily part of the text, but is interesting information nonetheless. Go to the last page of the book of Genesis, which in your Hebrew Bibles, your BHS, is page 85. Page 85. We've looked at the first page of Genesis, and now we're going to look at the last page of Genesis. On that last page of Genesis, you'll see the text concludes at the top part, or most of the page, and at the very bottom part, there's a little listing of notes. Look at your screen with me. You'll see now at the bottom of the page, highlighted in yellow on your screen, right above the Masorah Magna or the register and the textual apparatus, but underneath the biblical text, a listing of notes that the Masoretes placed there. Now you'll notice that there are no vowels there. The notes that appear at the end of each book in the Hebrew Bible simply count the words and the letters in each book. Now, why would they do something like that? Here's why. Remember, for the vast majority of the history of the Hebrew Bible, it was copied by hand. It wasn't reproduced with a printing press or digitally by a computer. It was copied by hand. When you copy things by your hand, the ability to make mistakes increases exponentially. So in order to prevent mistakes, the Masoretes used a system of counting words and letters so that once they copied a book, they would go back and count the words and the letters to make sure that they had copied it faithfully. That information is encoded at the end of each book, and you see it highlighted in yellow on your page. Well, just for fun, let's look at what that says at the end of Genesis 50. Look at your screens again. We've now magnified those notes at the bottom of the page so you can see them without a microscope. And on the right side of your screen, you'll see actually what is the Hebrew note, the Masoretic note. And on the left side of your screen, you'll see actually what that says. What that says. It says here, the number of the verses of the book are 1,534. And its midpoint, Genesis 20:40, and it has 605 paragraphs. Now, if you look at the Hebrew text on the right, the information without the dots over it, that's the basic Hebrew text that's telling you what's going on. Sakum hapasukim shel sefer, the number of the verses of the book. That's line 1. Then elef wachamesh meoth, 1,500 or 1,500. That's that second line. Ushaloshim wa arba'ah, and 30 and 4. They've spelled out the Hebrew numbers there. Now, if you want to go back to BBH chapter 12, you can see how those numbers work, and they simply appear there, but without vocalization or vowels. Then right below that, you see Hebrew consonants with dots over them. Now, those Hebrew consonants with dots over them is how they represent numbers, that is the actual numerals, not spelled out, but actually written like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you see in the left. All right? That's how they do it in Hebrew. It wasn't a older biblical thing. It's something that developed after the Bible had been written. Hebrew numbers in the Bible are spelled out. They don't just use the basic 1, 2, 3 system that we would count with in English, okay? So that's what's going on there. Again, it's not information that you need to memorize. It's not information you need to worry about. It's simply helpful to know why it's there and what it's doing. And it is actually encouraging because it teaches us or shows us that the Masoretes were very precise preservers of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, the manuscripts that we do have are amazingly accurate and reliable. And so information like this, although not necessary for reading the Hebrew Bible, reminds us of how important the Word of God is and the care with which men and women took in preserving it. Now, before we end this introductory lecture on the Hebrew Bible, I just want to focus on two different items. One that appears in the Masorah Parva and one in the accent system. So we've seen the Masorah Parva. It appears in that left-hand column or the right-hand column, the edge of the page, right? And we know that those are basic little Masoretic notes. We've also talked about, or I've showed you, that there's this accent system, and the accent system encodes basic grammatical information and singing, cantillation, the ability to chant the Hebrew text or to memorize it musically, okay? I want to just give you two brief snapshots of some of the information that's in there, some of the more important aspects of it. So first, I want to begin with talking about one issue in the Masorah that is important to be aware of, and that's the issue of the Kethiv Kareh. Kethiv Kareh. Let's look at our screens together. The names Kethiv and Kareh represent two transliterated Aramaic passive participles, meaning what is written and what is read. The Kethiv is the reading that comes from the consonantal text, and it is marked by a small circle above the word in question. Now that means that your Hebrew Bible has the text in it. Sometimes the consonants are going to have a little circle over it. That circle is going to mark the Kethiv, that is that consonantal text, what is written in the text, and it's going to identify a footnote in the Masorah, or a note in the Masorah. Back on your screens, the Kareh is the suggested correction, and it appears in the margin, marked by the consonant Kof for Kareh, with a small dot over the letter. Now here's the thing. The Masoretes were preservers of the consonantal text tradition. They would never willingly or knowingly modify the text, the consonantal text. When they wanted to represent an alternative reading or an alternative tradition in the reading, what they would do is they would mark the alternative reading by placing a little circle above the word in question and then placing a kof in the margin for the Kareh. That kof would mark the alternative reading option. So the Kethiv is what's in the text, the Kareh is the marginal reading, the suggested reading of the Masoretes. The Masoretes would never touch the consonantal text. So what they would do is they would place a note in the margin. They marked it with a circle and a kof. Let me show you what I mean. Turn in your Hebrew Bibles now to Judges 13:17. Judges 13:17, which is page 426 in your Hebrew Bible. Once you get there, you'll see highlighted on this screen a block of text in yellow. A block of text in yellow. In that block of text, there is a Kethiv Kareh issue. That is, there's a word written in the text of the Hebrew Bible that the Masoretes want to suggest an alternative reading for. If you see the text highlighted in yellow on your screen, find that same block of text on your Hebrew Bible page. In the next screenshot, we're going to highlight that by blowing it up for you. Here's what we're looking at. On your screens, you will now see Judges 13:17 enlarged and scanned from your Hebrew Bible. Verse 17 begins at the very left-hand side of the top line. It begins with the Hebrew construction, Wayomer, and he said. And it reads this way, Wayomer Manoach El Melach, Yahweh, Mi Shemecha Ki Yavo Devarecha Wa Kibad Nucha. It's translated roughly in English as, and Manoah said to the angel of Yahweh, what is your name? So that when your words come, we may honor you. Now, the two things that I'm concerned about in this text for our purposes today are the two items highlighted in yellow. Look at the end of verse 17, and you'll see the construction devarecha. Here you have the masculine plural noun devar with a 2ms pronominal suffix, your words, your words. You can see right above the resh a small circle or a circule. That small circle identifies the fact that the Masoretes want you to look at the note in the margin. You can see that note in the margin also highlighted in yellow. Do you see that note highlighted in yellow has two lines to it? In the bottom line, you see simply a kof with a dot over it. That marks the Kareh, meaning this. That's the reading that the Masoretes want you to go with. That's the consonantal text they want you to put back into the main text. Now the kof marks the Kareh, and you can see right above the kof 4 consonants. Dalet, Beit, Resh, and Kaf. Those are the consonants that the Masoretes want you to read with the vowels. Now, here's the thing. You'll notice that the vowels that appear in the biblical text in verse 17 itself, the word highlighted in yellow, actually don't make sense or don't work with that particular word. Look at the vocal schwa underneath the resh. That vocal schwa shouldn't be there underneath the resh because then the yod has no vowel to which it is related. That vowel pointing system does not work with the consonantal system that it appears with. What the Masoretes are asking you to do, now this is a little tricky, but it's worth knowing about. The Masoretes are asking you to take the vowels that appear in the text with the big word that you see there in verse 17, and to use those vowels with the consonants that you see in the margin. Meaning this, the Masoretes are asking you to read not the plural words, but the singular word. So the Masoretes are saying, hey, in this particular instance, that yod indicates that we have a plural noun, devarim, words. But really, it should be singular, devar. Now, why are they saying that? Well, look at the verb that occurs in the biblical text right before the highlighted yellow word at the end of verse 17, yavo. Yavo is the kal, imperfect, 3ms form from the Hebrew root bo, meaning to come, and it's singular. The subject of the verb follows, devarecha. Now, the singular verb wants to take a singular subject. And so they're suggesting that you don't read the plural subject, devarecha. They're saying you should read the singular subject, devarecha. All right, so here's how it's working again. It's complicated, but you need to be aware of this. These are the most important changes that the Masorah identifies for you, the difference between kareh and kathiv. The text is asking you to take the vowels that you see in the consonantal text on the page and read it with the consonants you see in the margin. So you've got to do a little bit of adding, some work there. You take the consonants in the margin, you add the vowels that you see in the text, and you get your construction. That's the phenomenon of kathi karev, and it's the most important phenomenon that's identified for us in the Masorah. So that's why we spend some time in it. If you're reading commentaries or journal articles or you're progressing in your studies, and you'll come across notes about the kathiv and the kareh and the options that they give to you, now you'll know where that comes from, and you can actually check them and make sure that the books are correct. Never trust the books on your own. Always make sure that you're checking the text yourself to make sure that it's been accurately rendered. Good. Now we just want to talk about one final feature before we bring this lecture to a conclusion, and that's I want you to look at your screen again with me and consider a few Hebrew accents. A few Hebrew accents. Now, I've mentioned before that the system of Hebrew accents encodes some kind of musical information and some grammatical information. And there are a lot of different accents. Now, you can have access to that information in the introduction to your Hebrew Bible, or you can get the book, something like Introduction to the BHS, and you can read about the accent system. And there are even a number of different books dedicated to understanding these accents. Now, the accents in Hebrew can be complicated, but there are a few of them that are worth noting from the beginning. A few of them that are worth noting from the beginning, and I've highlighted those in yellow for you. First, I want to begin with the marks that you see at the end of each verse appearing in yellow on your screen now. Now, let me just say that there are a lot of different items accented in yellow on your screen. We're going to be talking here about 3 of them. They are the double diamonds that appear one on top of the other at the end of each verse. So look at the end of verse 1, right after the Hebrew noun construction, haaretz. And you'll see double diamonds highlighted in yellow, one diamond on top of the other. Now look at the end of verse 2, on the 3rd line, at the very right-hand side of your screen, after the Hebrew construction, hamayim. And then look at the end of verse 3, kind of at the middle of the last line, right after the Hebrew word or. Again, those double diamonds. You should see 3 sets of double diamonds on your screen right now highlighted in yellow. That marking is known as sof pasuk. Sof pasuk. You can see it spelled on the bottom of your screen, sof pasuk. The sof pasuk marks the end of each Hebrew verse in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, sof pasuk is an English transliteration of the Hebrew construction sof pasuk, which means end of verse. So this is very convenient. Now, when the Hebrew Bible was originally written, there were no verse numbers, paragraph markers, chapter titles, or punctuation, no vowels or accents. So once again, these are perspired, helpful pieces of information that the Masoretes have included so that we can know, hey, when does this verse end? It divides up the longer lines into discrete blocks of text that you can work with. The Sof Pasuk. Now this accent mark or this marking is very distinctive and easy to see, the Sof Pasuk. The next item I want you to look at in the Hebrew text is the Athnak. Athnak. In English, Athnak. There are 3 Athnaks highlighted in yellow on your screen. The Athnak marks the logical midway point in the verse. It marks the logical midway point in the verse. So look at verse 1, and you will see Bereshith, Bara, Elohim. Under Elohim, you will see highlighted in yellow a little arrowhead underneath the hay of Elohim. That little arrowhead, or a triangle without a base, is the Athnak. That's the Athnak. And the Athnak marks the logical halfway point in the verse. Now, not every verse in the Hebrew Bible has an Athnak, but most of them do. And this item is very helpful to see because when you begin to translate Hebrew, you'll see these long sentences or verses, and you'll be overwhelmed at first at all the information in there. What the accents can help you to do is to divide your verses up into units. And you can begin by translating smaller portions of the verse, and then putting those portions of the verse together. So the Athnak helps you break up the verse logically and grammatically. So it's a very helpful item to see in the text, the Hebrew accent Athnak. Now the Athnak is what's known as a disjunctive accent in Hebrew, and there are 2 basic kinds of accents in Hebrew, conjunctive and disjunctive. Conjunctive accents glue words together. Disjunctive accents break words and phrases apart. It's much more important at this point that you learn to see the disjunctive accents because those are the accents that will break verses up into smaller units for you to translate. And the Athnak is the big one that you want to see because it's going to divide a verse in half for you, the Athnak. You can see that in the Elohim word in verse 1. Let's look for it in verse 2. In verse 2, you can see in line 2 on your screen, right in the middle of the line, tahom, the Hebrew word tahom, meaning deep. Al panei tahom, over the face of the deep. Under the hay in tahom, you'll see the exact same accent mark, the Athnak. It marks the logical halfway point in the verse. Now, what I mean by logical is this. It doesn't mark the numerical halfway point in the verse. That is, there are 10 words in the verse, and after 5 you get the Athnak. That's not always the case. Sometimes the Athnak will come after the first word in the verse. But in this particular instance, it occurs about halfway. But it marks the logical halfway point. Go all the way down now to your last line in the Hebrew text on your screen, and you'll see the Athnak under or, the first or there. Now, there are 2 ors in verse 3. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, vayehi or. The first or in verse 3 has the Athnak in it highlighted in yellow. It marks the logical halfway point of the verse. So we've covered the Sof Pasuk, the ending of the verse, and we've also covered the Athnak, the logical midpoint of the verse. There's one other item that's important to recognize, and that's the Saluk, the Saluk. There are also 3 Saluks highlighted in your text. The Saluk always appears on the last word of the verse. The Saluk always appears on the last word of the verse. It's a small vertical stroke that will appear just to the left of a vowel if there's any there. Look at the last word in Genesis 1:1, haaretz. Underneath the aleph, you will see highlighted in yellow the Saluk, right to the left of the comets, the Saluk. In a Hebrew sentence, in each Hebrew verse in the Hebrew Bible, the Saluk and the Sof Pasuk always appear together. Let me say that again. The Saluk and the Sof Pasuk always appear together. The Saluk will appear under the last word, and the Sof Pasuk will appear after the last word. So then go all the way to the end of verse 2, the very first word you'll see in line 3 on your screen, Hamayim. You can see underneath the mim in the word for the waters, you will see just next to the comets on the left, the saluk, that small vertical stroke. It appears on the last word in verse 2, and it always appears with the sof pasuk. Finally, in verse 3, the very last word of verse 3, or, you can see underneath the aleph, highlighted in yellow, the saluk, followed by sof pasuk. So think of it this way. When you're looking at a sentence in Hebrew or a verse in Hebrew, at the end of each verse, you will see saluk, sof pasuk, and that always marks the end of the verse. In most of the verses in the Hebrew Bible, you'll see the athnak, and that will mark the midpoint in the verse logically. So when you know those things, you'll be able to break up your Hebrew verses and translate them in bits and pieces. It's like process abstraction. If the whole verse overwhelms you, begin with half of it. Translate that half, work with the second half. And it's also nice because it's helping you to figure out the logic in the text, the halfway point. Now, in those particular forms that have those accents, just so you know, whenever a form has one of those major disjunctive accents on them or under them, for example, the athnak or the saluk, they call those forms pausal forms. The other forms are contextual, but those forms with the accents on them that are disjunctive, the major disjunctives, the athnak and the saluk, are called pausal. The reason they're called pausal forms is this. In the reading tradition, in the cantillation tradition where you would sing or chant the text, when you were reading, you would pause on those words, noting in your speech the logical break itself. So in some sense, you would both represent those in the written form and in the spoken or chanted form of the text, and that's what they do. Well, that's a long introduction to the Hebrew Bible, but again, if you're studying on your own, it's helpful to have a basic orientation. If you're still confused about some of these items, the best thing to do then is to read Basics of Biblical Hebrew, chapter 36, where we go over much of this same information. Additionally, there are books and resources out there that will explain further many of these details. We've placed that information in the bibliography in the back of chapter 36. So we just haven't left you alone. We've given you certain resources that you can acquire to go further in your studies. But for the most part, the information presented in this chapter is simply orientation. When you open the page of your Hebrew Bible, you now know that the stuff in the margins are Masoretic notes. At the very bottom, modern text critical notes. And then inside the text, you can see minor reading issues. You see the consonants and the vowels and the accent marks and the paragraph markers, and even, thankfully, verse references and chapter numbers. All of those things work together to provide you with a suitable reading environment. So that concludes our lecture and all of the lectures for Basics of Biblical Hebrew. It has been my pleasure and privilege to work to provide you these resources and these lectures. I hope that you will enjoy your study of Hebrew, and that you will enjoy even more reading God's Word, and that you will enjoy even more discovering the character of God and the grace for His people as you read His Word.